This is a project combining the Institute for Learning Technologies, as you heard here at TC, with WNET. And we're taking the approach that we've been using in ILT, namely an embodied cognition approach. This is fairly new, where you look at people's thinking and understanding in terms of creating a mental perceptual simulation, having educational activities that do that. And we find that it increases their learning and their understanding, and they really get a sort of feel for phenomena rather than just knowing about it. So we're trying to apply that here to do this for fractions, which kids who usually don't have a feel for it, do very many nonsensical things with. And we're hoping we can develop some mobile apps that will allow them to have a better understanding of fractions, which has been a gateway skill for algebra and lots of other things to follow. So we have a couple of our WNET colleagues here, and they'll tell you about, we're drawing upon characters and their experience with storylines and stuff from their Cyberchase TV show, and they've also done games before, but not ones using this particular kind of design. And we have an NSF grant that supports the research. We're trying to research the factors that yield the best behavior and stuff. Along with this, does narrative make much of a difference? Does this embodied gestures make much of a difference? And so forth. So we're developing these for touch-based interfaces on things like tablets, like the iPad, and smartphones, like the iPhone. And we're going through an iterative series of developments. We develop one, test it out, and kids develop based upon that another version, and so forth. So we're kind of midway through that process and this initial exploratory phase with this project. So you'll have a chance to see it. You'll hear some background about Cyberchase. We've got the iPad here with the first version of the app up on there that we can show you. And you can see what we're up to. We'll be interested in your reactions to it. Okay, so now, Sandra, you want to tell them about Cyberchase?
Okay, great. I want to underscore John's mention of the collaboration between WNET and TC, because it's the first collaboration, and at WNET really our motto is media with impact, and I think that is really underscored in our work with kids, and certainly working with this fantastic team, but a leading research and education institution here at TC. It's a wonderful partnership, so we're hoping to have it grow. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of background on Cyberchase. And with all of the properties that we've developed at WNET for children, we really start with the need. Is there a gap in the marketplace? And although Cyberchase launched more than a decade ago, I think the need is ever more present, and that is to build kids' math literacy skills. So let me tell you a little bit about the project, if you're not familiar. We aim the project at 7 to 11-year-olds. We get a much broader audience, slightly older online, slightly younger on air. We certainly align a lot of our work to standards. And the conceit of the series is pretty simple. There are 3 kids, a diverse trio, who in every episode have one mission, and that is to track down trouble, which comes in the form of the dastardly hacker. And they cannot use brawn, but they have to use brain and math and problem-solving skills. And so really our mission is to send kids the message that math is everywhere, it's an important tool, and really to underscore that everybody can be a problem solver. Oh, before we go to the next slide, are any of you familiar with Cyberchase? Okay, so I have a question, and I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. Whoever raises their hand first, I'm going to call on. It's going back to grade school, like Cyberchase. So who plays the voice of the villain? In the back.
Oh, no, I thought it was Google Doc Friedman.
Oh, very good. He plays Digit.
He plays Digit, yeah.
Who plays the voice of the villain? Does anybody know? Yes.
His name escapes me, but he also plays Doc in Back to the Future.
Yes.
Yeah.
You get it. T-shirt. It's the hacker, and it's Christopher Lloyd, and that's for you. So, very good. He's actually been with us for all 100 episodes, and I have to say he's a consummate performer, and he really believes that the work that he does on the show gives back to children, so it's been a great experience. So on to just the approach we take with really all of our properties, but specifically with Cyberchase. It's very much of a cross-platform approach. You know, from the get-go, we actually launched the series online 11 years ago, which at the time was somewhat pioneering. But there's 100 episodes, there's a lot of web games, we've begun work in mobile, but I think one of the important elements is our relationship to the community. We really believe in bringing our content into the community, into schools, into after-school programs, with a focus on reaching out to kids who may need math enrichment the most. A little bit about the learning impact. We've had the good fortune of being funded by the National Science Foundation from actually day one, and have done 20 studies over the course of the project to look at various aspects, from character and stories to some of the interactivity, outreach, both formative and summative. And a couple years back we did a fairly significant multi-year study that looked at the cumulative benefits of combining media, storytelling in the videos and narrative-based games. And the results have been very encouraging. We've seen some significant gains in children's problem solving, the sophistication of their skills, and certainly in their attitude towards math. So since we're a math show, I have to share a couple of numbers with you. We do keep a careful track of the metrics for Cyberchase. And I put up this slide because I think it's interesting to note a trend, and that is there's certain kids are still watching television, and educational media is you know, in large numbers. But what you'll see is that about 2/3 of our audience are consuming our content on mobile. And it's probably not a surprise, but it's growing at a very rapid rate. Certainly that's a much larger percentage than it was a year ago. So that, you know, certainly in terms of how we deliver content, but also how we create content that is meaningful, you know, we're driven by these metrics. And then finally, I would not be a good producer if I didn't share a quote from our fans. And what's kind of fun is, you know, our first generation viewers, who were 6 or 7 at the time, are now on Facebook, so they're sending us all kinds of messages and posts. And, you know, it's every producer's dream that actually the content will have lasting impact. So when we hear that students are pursuing engineering, that's what we want. We hope that in a way we have some small part in you know, encouraging kids to love math and stick with it through their academic careers. So that's Cyberchase at a glance. I'm going to turn it over to Kristin to talk a little bit about our overall approach to gaming and narrative.
As soon as the slide changes. There we go. Since we are here to talk about game development in the mobile space, I'll talk a little bit about Cyberchase's approach to gaming. It's actually not that different than our approach to storytelling on air, which is that we create immersive stories and narratives that engage kids. And the temples for game development, like they are on air, are math and story and characters. So all of our games are set in cyberspace. We've developed throughout the years this awesome world where there are many different cyber sites, lots of different characters, and lots of whimsical places the kids go. So we have over 50 online games on the Cyberchase website that explore different cyber sites where we meet different characters and that continue the stories and the math concepts from our episodes. We have single-level games, multi-level games, and we actually have 4 immersive quest games which have been on our website for years and are still among the most popular across all of PBS Kids. We know that those games generate an immense amount of traffic. All of our games are designed with a cross-disciplinary team. So we have producers, writers, developers, content experts, and researchers all around the table at the same time developing the game from the outset, much like what we're doing here. And of course, scaffolding and reinforcement are built into every one of our games along the way to aid in the learning. Over the past couple years, we've dived more into mobile gaming, and with some generous grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting through the Department of Education, the Ready to Learn program, we've developed 2 tablet games called Cyberchase Shape Quest and Cyberchase 3D Builder. Both focus on the same math concepts: geometry, spatial reasoning, and problem solving, because we know that spatial reasoning is really a cornerstone for geometry and an area where kids have great need. So both games focus on that math topic. And then we actually created a new world, this kind of a transmedia spin-off for Cyberchase, set in Botopolis. And it's sort of a creation story for Buzz and Delete. We learned about how they came to be, and Buzz and Delete are two very popular characters on the show. They're bots, they're henchmen for the villain hacker who you've heard about. And kids love them, they're really lovable, so we wanted to make them the stars of their own show in a certain way. These apps take advantage of touchscreen, take advantage, of course, of the tactile interface to aid in learning, and ShapeQuest, which we just launched back in January, I'm happy to admit, or to announce, is doing really well. It was, in its first week on the App Store, the number one free kids game for iPad, which was immense, and the number 2 free educational game for iPad, ahead of some heavy-hitting brands like Disney and Barbie, I'd like to say. And ShapeQuest is unique because it takes advantage of augmented reality to aid in learning. And augmented reality has been incorporated in a lot of apps that you might find on the App Store, but it hasn't really been explored as a tool for learning a whole lot. So we really broke through and had a lot, we were up against a lot to try to figure out how that technology could work for us and work for kids in learning. But so far, the response has been really positive, the reviews have been really positive, and we were just nominated for a Webby Award this week, which is really exciting. So vote for us. And of course, like I said, narrative is the focus of all of it, which I think is a lovely segue into this project we're here to talk about today.
Okay. I'm a teacher, so I'm going to stand up. So you have to direct your attention this way. I think, Ben, if you want to man your station too. So what we're going to try to do is kind of ping pong back and forth between a few different pieces of information. What I'm going to go over with you now is, so we have this wonderful world of Cyberchase. For those of y'all who don't know the characters, like this is Hacker when they're talking about Hacker, this is Buzz and Delete, this is Digit, and these are the kids that are like, they save the day. And the best thing about Cyberchase is because it's in this cyber world, it affords us the ability to take them to any world, any place, any time, anything. So in terms of developing the game, which you'll see in a little bit, our job was then to take the underlying pedagogy and develop that into something that would be usable for a game format. So I'm just going to go over a little bit of that with you. So what the question is how do we take the way that we think about fractions, which are rooted in our world, and get kids to realize what this means? How do we get this symbol, which is some scary numbers and some semiotics that they have to formalize? How do we get that so that when they look at this, they're no longer intimidated by it? They go, I get it. It's 3 out of 7, right? So essentially where it comes from is as simple as this. Fractions comes from the world around us. When you split an apple with your sibling, you are committing a fraction, right? And if you think about it, the word fraction itself has the word action in it. And it's rooted, its etymology, its cognate is to fracture. So then if we're talking about how we're thinking about it, and from my perspective, what I'm curiously interested in, what embodiment is founded on, is you have these tracks, these spinal cortical tracks that run up your spine. They innervate into subcortical structures, in through your cerebellum, in through your medulla, in through structures in the substantia nigra, and into your thalamus. And then your thalamus takes those signals and distributes it to the neocortex, the outermost 2 millimeter layer of your brain. And all of these things work in tandem, in cooperation, to create the fact that, does anybody know where your first rhythm comes from?
Heart.
Your heart. And then do you know why 4 in music is so popular? Because you go like this. Right? So we have 4 limbs. Does anybody know why we have 10 digits in the Arabic numeral system? That's right, because we have 10 digits. So what it really is about is that math is rooted in the world that we come from. And that's where math thinking comes from. So in the hierarchy of math thinking, it goes like this. The first thing you do when you're an infant is you reach out for an object. You reach out, you grab mom's cheek, you reach out, you grab for your bottle. And then once you understand what it means, an object, how far away it is, what it means to have it in your hands, then you say, oh, I want more than one object. I'm going to get a collection of those objects. And then as soon as you get more than one object, now you're saying, how many of them are red? How many of them are green? How many of them are purple? So now you're coding, you're classifying, you're categorizing. That ability to do that starts to differentiate your environment, and now you're already beginning the underlying premises of mathematical thinking. From there, you say, how far do I have to go to get to the fridge, to get what I want? How far is school, right? And so the distances that we travel in life, the motions along the path, these are starting to enumerate our ability to negotiate our environment. Then from there we say, oh, I'm going to the orchard, I'm gonna get some apples, right? But we don't necessarily, we just fill the basket until it's full. So it's a collection of objects, but it's nondescript, but it has a container to it, right? And then the last thing we move on to is unitization. So we say, oh, we're gonna say that this size of a unit keeps going and going and going, and then it's regular, right? You have your feet, one and the other. When you're measuring, unfortunately for me, in New York real estate, if I'm judging a place I want to live in, my shoe is 12 inches long. So I can always know how many feet, what the dimensions of a room are. So then the idea for this game is, how do we take that one object, the beginnings of mathematical thinking, and teach them how to fracture? Teach them how to say, this is what a 1/2 is. And then from there move on to 1/3, 1/4, 1/5. And then in terms of communicating it, people talk with their hands, and so one of the affordances that we have is the affordance of gesture, and what gesture can do to connect us to our own thinking. So gesture in the research has been shown to be able to do a lot of things. You have people depicting structural aspects of things, spatial aspects, the correspondence between this and that, and actions. In another line of research, they had kids performing arithmetic operations, and what they found was that the kids who would pair numbers together to develop a strategy, so if you have like 8 + 5 + 3 is equal to, if you take the 5 and the 3 and you put them together, now you have 8 + 8. And that's helping kids develop these strategies. So now you have, not only is it structural, spatial correspondence and action, but now you can take your gestures and use them to develop strategies as well. So in fractions learning, in math learning, there's lots of different ways you can represent math. You can have manipulatives, very popular in early elementary ed. You can have depictions. You can have things like semiotics, like graphs, charts. Then you have the actual symbols that represent them. And of course you have language. We can talk back and forth to one another mathematically, right? And in that language is included our nonverbal language. There's a researcher now at Barnard named Colleen McCrink, and what she does is she looks at what infants' capacities are. I think she may have done work with another researcher down at NYU, Karen Adolph, but they look at what infants can do long before they can speak. And one of the things they can do is they can point and they can gesture, and they can communicate to you far more than they can before they can speak. So in representing fractions, what are we going to do? Are we going to represent them circularly, linearly, as boxes, as shapes, three-dimensionally? Can we represent them contextually as a piece of cake? And then can we take that and connect it to its semiotic representation of 1/2? So then that brings us to the game. And so Ben, I don't know if you have the game pulled up,
Yeah.
if you want to show them.
So I'm going to show you basically what we've developed. And Michael is going to talk about how the design and the activities that are represented in the game came out of research that we did with kids in schools. So,
Do you have volume, Ben?
we actually have two different views of this. So I'm going to kind of direct your attention. This is the direct one, so it'll be a little bit easier to see. Something that we did want to show is we keep mentioning gesture and embodiment. This is a really essential aspect of the game. So in order to show that, even though it's not perfect, this is going to allow me to show you the gestures and their meaning within the activities. So that's why this one is here. And we're going to start with Kristin's going to talk a little bit about the narrative aspect of this particular game.
Well, the narrative, since as Dr. Black mentioned, this is an iterative development process, the narrative is changing. But I'll describe a little bit where the narrative is now, and what you're seeing here is our first iteration of the game, which is very, very early prototype. And I could talk a little bit about where we're going and decisions that we've made based on the first round of testing. But we are set here in the lovely cyber site Penguia. It's an icy, snowy cyber site, very popular in the Cyberchase world. And a particular penguin who's a friend of our cyber squad, Fluff, lives in Penguia. And his cyber site's in trouble in this version of the game. Hacker has broken the Climatron, the machine that keeps Penguia snowy and icy. So we have to power up bots that are going to fix the Climatron and restore Penguia and keep it from melting. I think that's who you see on screen here is Jackie. She's one member of our cyber squad, and she takes kids through the game process currently. Where things are going to go in iteration 2 is that we will actually have Fluff on screen as the on-screen agent, and the structure of the game, the narrative of the game is going to change slightly, but I don't know if you want to wait to get there.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Yeah.
So just to kind of reiterate, so this is Jackie. She takes you through the game. These robots here, the premise that we came up with is we said we have to have an object for the kids to fraction, right? And so what we came up with was that they're creating fuel cells, and the fuel cells go into these robots. And what that allows us to do is it allows us to give them a repetitive exercise that's also dynamic. And that's important even if you go to the neuroscience literature. That's how the Hebbian synapse works, is it works through context, always changing, but then kind of repeating that same impulse over and over. So in terms of how did we decide what gestures to use, the first study that we conducted was last summer. It was an exploratory study over here at PS 154 here in Harlem. And what we decided was we wanted to not bias their tendencies to tell us just what they've already been given in school. What we wanted to give them was an open platform to explain to us how they conceptualize what a fraction is, what it means to have a half of something, what it means to have a third of something. So we gave them a plain piece of paper and pencils and markers and crayons, and we asked them to draw examples that we gave them from questions that we asked. We gave them opportunities to pour liquids and show us equivalence between fractions or lack of equivalence between fractions. We gave them strings and allowed them to cut the strings and figure out what a half of it was, or a third, or a fourth, or a 12th. And then we gave them this scaffolded piece of paper that they could make equivalency judgments under the premise that the depictions on the page were brownie trays, and we wanted to know, like, would you get more brownie out of this tray if you only got one piece, or would you get more brownie out of this tray if you got one piece? And so what we did in this study was we interviewed kids in a clinical interview in either triads, and the triads was suggested by a consultant that we have, Dick Lesh. And what he was suggesting was that sometimes what the richness of people's understandings comes from the way they communicate them. So we didn't just want to have this interviewer and student relationship. We wanted them to be able to work collaboratively with one another, and the chances that when they were communicating their ideas between each other, that might reveal even more information for us. And then the other one was we interviewed students singly as well. So from that, like I said, we provided them the plain paper, the scaffolded assessment, the string, and then from there we videotaped them. After we videotaped them, then we provided them assessment. So I want to show you these videos, and I want you to pay particular attention to their hands. Here they're answering, what is a hole?
We have a hole here. It's when you have little pots that makes up a big pot. It's like
Okay. So here's another one.
What does it mean to have a hole or something?
All right, so I'm going to give you.
Can we repeat that? Okay. What about you? What's a hole? Do you know more?
a hole is like, for example, I had a candy bar
Okay.
and I cut it into one hole.
Which is the smallest?
And I counted them and
Okay.
the lines are separate.
Let's look at it a little closer.
So the first one I got was 2 foot.
So this person is
All right.
and the hole is what? This
Okay,
person.
so it's the defendant board.
And it's a hole.
So how many holes actually was in the episode?
So And then this last one I want to show you. So in fractions learning, in gesture literature, there's something called a speech-gesture mismatch. And what they say is that gesture is actually a bridge to conceptual learning, which is the whole premise that we're operating off of. So I want you to notice what he's going to say, it might be hard for you to hear, is he's going to say you have to split it into halves, but I want you to watch his gesture. This is this student right here.
We have to try to figure out how to slice it in half.
Okay.
And see how.
Anybody see that? What was his gesture? His gesture was in quarters, and you know what we asked him? What does it mean to have 1/4 of something? So he calls them a half, but he refers to them with his body as a quarter, and this is exactly what we're trying to capitalize on. So just some results of this. So essentially what we ended up doing is we want to say, how can we take the action of cutting butter, combine it with the action of making evaluations, delineating boundaries, and develop it into a game. And that's what we have over there on the far screen.
So I'll talk about a little of the activities, and I'm going to refer back to some of those videos that Michael just showed and how these are really based on what we saw with the students. So the first part is an estimation activity. This, what we call an energy bar, is basically like a number line in this activity. So if you think right here is 0, and the end here is 1, I'm going to estimate where 1/5 is on that line. And this type of knowledge has been shown to really be an indicator of how well students understand fractions. If this is something that you can do and do well, then you have a good understanding of ratio, and that can predict your algebraic understanding, your math achievement later on, say in high school. So if I do this, I'm going to pull, and I'm going to just estimate where 1/5 is.
And that gesture, by the way, for that is based on when people go, I once caught a fish this big. Right? So you're spanning out your quantity estimation.
And it's actually something that we saw when people were trying to figure out what fraction, say, was in a container with liquid in it. They would do a spanning gesture, and so that's where that actually came from. So here you can think of the one girl who said this is the whole, and then she sliced things up like this. So we're going to do basically the same thing. I'm going to cut this into a number of pieces. And this is actually getting at two different things. One, if I have a good understanding of fractions, each of these pieces need to be exactly the same size. That's one thing that some students might not know. Another thing is the denominator that's highlighted here, there needs to be 5 parts to this shape, or it needs to be separated into 5 different parts. And so I need to make 4 lines in order to do that. So not only the gesture, but this is how it's relating these important concepts. And then if students are not getting it correct, they're getting some feedback. So try again. In order to scaffold this for students, say if they don't have a good understanding, they'll get a few attempts. And then we'll have dotted lines that come up in order to sort of help them get to where they need to go. So I'll redo the gesture here. So now that we're building understanding of the denominator, or the lower part of that fraction, we're going to try to build understanding of the top part. So what they really need to do is select 1 out of these 5. And another concept that's sort of important is that 1 can be any one that's separated into these pieces here. So I can choose that one.
Yeah, what you're all not hearing is a voiceover that goes with this. Jackie's talking to you.
Is she giving feedback?
Yeah.
I can turn it up. I don't know if she's
How
able
much
to do that.
is 1/6 of this bar? Drag the pin to estimate.
So I'm going to go through the same process for this
Got it.
fraction.
Now split the energy bar into 6 equal parts. Swipe
So-
down on the bar to split it.
You see little design aspects like the 6 flashes and is in green.
Try again.
So all of that is supposed to highlight the connection between that numerical representation
Try again.
and
Awesome. Remember to power up this
what they're
energy
actually,
bar.
the actual activity that's going on.
1/6 of the whole power. Swipe the number of parts you need from the whole amount here.
So I'll select it.
All right. Pinch and drag the fraction part down to the box in the corner to save the 1/6.
And then put it in the bank.
Powered up all 5 bars.
Let's
So-
put them in one of Motherboard's nanobots so it can get to work.
Just want to note that this is Scratch Trap.
Not the real voices.
It's our developer's daughter.
Don't worry about it. To power up a nanobot, you need to get back the 5 energy bars that you saved. Pinch and drag the box in the corner onto the nanocell.
So in this activity, so we've kind of gotten at the real basic understanding of what does a denominator mean, what does the numerator mean, and how they're related. So 1/6 or 1/5 would actually be a fairly small ratio if you think about it, much less than say 4/5 or something like that. But what kids really struggle
Here are the
with
fractions from the 5 fractured energy bars.
is
In order
comparing
from
those.
smallest to largest by tapping and dragging them.
A well-known thing that kids struggle with is called a whole number bias, where they think fractions work exactly like whole numbers. So 1 would be small, 6 would be bigger than that, and then 100 would be much bigger than that. Fractions actually work in the opposite way. The larger the denominator is, the smaller the ratio is. So in this activity, we're focusing on that. So what's the smallest fraction would go here, the largest would go here. And if students are thinking in this whole number bias, they're going to organize the fractions in this way. So 1/2, it would be the smallest, and 1/6, and they're just looking at these numbers on the bottom here. I think 2 is small, so that must be the smallest one, or it's the smallest one up here on the screens.
Red means a fraction is in the wrong slot and you need to move it. The fractions need to be placed from smallest to largest.
So you can hear some of the feedback that's involved. Even though I put them in wrong, I was lucky and I got 1. But if I go through and kind of persist in this wrong representation and I do it again,
Oops. Red means a fraction is in the wrong slot and you need to move it.
they pop
The
back out.
fractions need to be placed from smallest to largest.
So this is really trying to get students to think. They're not going to be able to persist in this wrong notion of how fractions work. They really have to think about this deeply and come up with, sort of revise their knowledge. So if I do put them in the correct order,
Their energy bars are back. Cool. Now you need to plug in the bars.
so the bottom turns green,
Plug from the bottom of each energy bar up to the top of the bar by dragging it.
and I actually have 2 number lines here. One would be sort of horizontal, the other would be in a vertical way, where they can actually compare these numbers and see which ones are smaller ratios and which ones are bigger. So Dr. Black mentioned embodied cognition. So smaller ratios would need smaller movements in that with my finger. So I'm gonna.
And this gesture that Ben is doing right now, essentially what he's doing, he's determining the magnitude of something by dragging it from its point of origin to its ceiling, right? And where we got this from was when the kids were taking the liquids and comparing them, it's exactly what they did. They would go between two glasses and they would point to the bottom and they would go like this. So that's the embodiment of this notion of magnitude that we're trying to implement in this representation.
Right, and like I was saying, 1/6 is a smaller ratio, so the movement that I'm going to make with my finger is actually going to be smaller than the one that I would make for 1/2. And if you want to know what's defined as the one or the whole, that would be from down here all the way to the top of this area on the screen. So then I'm going to pull these over.
How the energy bars are plugged into the verifier. The smallest fraction is at the bottom and the largest is at the top.
So
One
I get a-
nanocell ready to power up a nanobot. Thanks for your help.
So in that
Guide
part,
the nanocell into the nanobot.
I get a real visual understanding of how these fractions compare to each other. And then I'm going to throw it in the bot and he's powered up, ready to go.
Right away so it can get to work. Awesome job. This bot is ready to go. Now on to the other bots.
So this process actually gets repeated.
How much is 1 cent?
The process actually gets repeated a number of times so that students not only get an understanding of these smaller ratios like 1/6, something like that, but go through a number of different fractions. And it's all focused on getting students to revise this whole number bias and think in ratio. So that's the whole focus. And I'm going to throw it back to Michael. He's going to talk about some of the...
So just talk a little bit more. So then after we developed the game based on our exploratory study, and Kristin, if you want to interject at any point, one of the things too, just as a caveat, is the game that you're looking at, that's our first iteration of the game. All those audio tracks are scratch tracks. We've actually seen some usability from the kids using the game. Here, I'll let you watch this one of him using it. You can pay particular attention to when he goes, yes. But basically, what we found was there are different things visually if you use a design-based approach that we have to change. So for instance, you saw a number line that was vertical over there with the verifier where you drag those magnifiers over. Those need to be consolidated along a vertical line, and they can't be spread out like that, because what it does is that it diverts kids' attention away from the hierarchy of the fractions, which is really what we want them to focus on. And you might see with him, I don't know if he already did it, but he goes to swipe it, and it doesn't respond initially, so we're working on everything from like improving the hot zone. And you look, his initial swipe, I want to show you that really quick. Okay, so when he puts in the wrong answer, because it's supposed to be 3/4, right there, you see him pause? What he's doing is he's figuring out a way, and you see how he just submitted his answer? So those are the types of pieces of data that when we data mine them, and I see a few people from Ryan Baker's team, we're going to be doing a data analysis from the entire log of the game, and that data is going to be invaluable because not only will we have this observational data, but we'll have logs of data that will show us how they're improving, how many trials it takes them to improve, how long it takes them to improve, and whether or not they develop any strategies over the course of their time. There you see feedback, so you pick too many, and so you see the red feedback. So I'll go ahead and stop that. So you can see that they do enjoy playing the game. The 5th graders tended to enjoy it a little less, but we kind of expected that because 5th grade is the top of the 3 years of fractions that they teach in school. And this is really elementary aspect of fractions learning. So in what we administered for this study, we gave them 2 different assessments. We gave them an assessment of general fractions knowledge as well as an assessment of problems that were basically pictorial representations of the exact same activities that they're doing on the screen. We videotape them, and then we let 4 different groups randomly assigned to 4 conditions. One is a strong narrative with conceptual gestures. One is a strong narrative with deictic gestures, and to explain what deictic gestures. So in our comparison and our research, because it's a tablet-based device, we can't do gesture versus no gesture. Gestures are the only way you interact with a tablet. So what we've done is we're comparing a conceptual gesture by saying, hey, I sliced it, versus saying, I sliced it. And while there's other research that's out right now where they're having a little bit of difficulty in picking up a difference between that, we're hoping that like when Ryan Baker's team helps us look at this data, that we'll start to pull out more subtle findings that will start to differentiate the conceptual gestures versus the non-conceptual gestures. And then in terms of the narrative, what we have is, if I can back up for a second. Okay, so we have two games. They're the exact same game, but one of them has this rich narrative, and the other one is that they are just fractioneers doing fractions. While I really like the name fractioneers, but essentially, and what we're testing there in terms of Cyberchase is whether or not their investment of saying, oh, I'm not just creating fractions, I'm like powering up robots, and those robots are going to save the penguins, and I'm going to be saving the day. So that's really what we're trying to capitalize on, and whether or not their investment in the narrative contributes to their engagement, their motivation, and their learning. So I explained this a little bit. So we have preliminary data, but it's just our pre and post data. But we are finding that across all four conditions, kids are improving significantly in terms of their fractions knowledge. So, and we have that both with their general fractions information as well as in the direct assessment as well. And we just finished collecting our data 2 weeks ago, and I'm almost done coding all of that data, and then we're going to be able to do more assessments. We're going to be able to pick out, well, how well did they do on numeration problems specifically, and does that differentiate by condition? How well did they do on denominator problems, and does that differentiate by condition? And then we'll also have all this gameplay data in terms of strategy, time on task, motivation, engagement, everything. So let me show, Ben spoke briefly about what's called the whole number bias, right? So what they, yeah?
Before you get started, we're actually running out of time here, so I think maybe why don't we just stop there?
All right.
Good job, though.
Because I wanted to get time for the discussion to go along.
Sure.
Okay. We're fortunate to have Alice Wilder, who's a graduate of TC and had a distinguished career in children's media, and we wanted to get her reaction.
There's no pressure or anything.
This is off the top of her head. So.
Yeah, so this is my first time hearing this, and gosh, I have so many different thoughts about all of this. So let me first just say what an honor, and there's so many things that I love about this. One, of course, as you've all already mentioned, is the collaboration, right? One of my favorite things about Teachers College and having been at Teachers College is there's so many fantastic thinkers and people here that all are doing work that are for the kids, and we all want to change the world. And so being able to combine resources in an entertainment field with the thinking and the brains around here is just fabulous, and I try to take advantage of TC as well. The other thing that I think is so interesting about today and now for all of you is that that goes along with the TC collaboration is that everything I learned here at Teachers College is being expressed through some of this work, right? The digital world now gives us a chance to prove out in education and learning what theorists like Dewey or all these people that we learned about here at TC have been saying for years, right? It's not just that gestures are so what you mentioned was that gesture is the bridge to conceptual knowledge. Well, that is true, and it's fantastic, and it's amazing that you're doing this work. But back in the day when we were doing Blue's Clues, right, there's also like media and entertainment. Back in the day before we had all the technology to do this, capitalizing on what the learning theory is, what we learned here at TC. Things like, well, media was always good at making things visual. Concepts that you can't understand another way, you can really express through media. So that's one of the powers. When we started with Blue's Clues, there was no iPad from 2010, but we figured out a way to make it interactive, right? So by knowing our audience, the host of our show would ask a question out to the kids, and he would pause, right? We had the 4-beat pause. He would pause, my job was to test all of our content with kids. So kids would ask me like, does he know what I'm saying? And I would say, well, he doesn't really know what you're saying. I mean, he knows that he has an idea of what you're thinking and saying, but he doesn't actually hear you. And so we were able to use things like interactivity. Back in the day, again, it's hard to imagine today without that interactivity. But back in the day, it was like making the most of interactivity because we all know that interaction is the way to learn. Right? By having a discussion, it's really much better than us all sitting up here and talking. We would actually get a lot more from each other if we had that interaction. Visuals help a ton. Narrative. Back in the day of Sesame Street, when Joan Gantz Cooney was starting Sesame, the idea was that advertisements were the thing that were capturing kids' attention, and there weren't really narratives along with children's media. Fred Rogers was changing that as well at the time. And with Blue's Clues, we were able to come along and say, no, kids can pay attention for longer than those short interactive segments, and they can also be used for learning. And then you mentioned so well the connection to the real world, to real life. This is all classroom stuff, right? These are all things that I learned. I graduated in '98, but like these are all things that I learned that we are able to apply so elegantly and perfectly to the digital world. And so I'm super glad to see you all doing this work. And I think what's really interesting today about the digital world, and I could probably go on forever and I won't, because I want to hear from you guys, but what's really interesting in the digital world today is because anyone and everyone can make an app these days, right? There are close to 700,000 apps in the App Store that are marked educational and that are out there and accessible to parents. So another kudos to you all for working together, because you're studying it, you're being methodical about it, you're taking the learning principles from Teachers College and other places and applying it in a way for good, right? And then integrating it with narrative and what you all are so good at from a production perspective. And that's essential, and we need a lot more of that today. And we need to figure out even more so how to market it, right? How do you become seen if you do actually know what you're doing and you do know some child development research. And then the last thing I'll say is just about the importance of talking to kids, right? So that's what I do for a living, and I'll tell you the short story of how I got into this field. But so when I was in college, I worked in a memory and cognition lab, and my advisor took me out to schools and had me talking to kids and getting into their brains. And then I saw the movie Big. Do you all know the movie Big? From that moment on, I wanted to be Josh. I wanted to play Tom Hanks' character in real life. So I wanted to be the person who sat in the room thinking like a kid and asking that question, what's so great about that? Because I actually knew what kids thought. And so for all of our shows, we actually take scripts into kids 2 or 3 times in the production of every episode, so that we're developing each one with the child. And we're doing it for entertainment as well as for comprehension, as well as for learning, as well as what you all start doing, which is for impact, right? And there are a lot of people who, again, don't start with, what do we want kids to walk away with? Because truthfully, in the world of media, what we learned from people like Dan Anderson is kids are active participants in whatever it is that they're consuming, but what are they walking away with, right? And you always have to ask yourself that. Who are you inviting over to your iPad and leaving with your child? So I'll kind of end there.
Okay, thank you. Actually, as Alice mentioned, this project really fits well within TC's traditions. 100 years ago, John Dewey emphasized the importance of giving kids the right experience to relate their learning to. You can't really learn something you haven't had related experiences in the world, and that's what we're trying to do with the fractions here. And Edward Thorndike emphasized the importance of doing your empirical research to validate what you're doing, and that's exactly what we're doing too. We're going to make sure that kids really learn from this and what they learn and understand. So any questions or comments from the audience? Yes.
I don't know this is probably a question for Michael, but I don't know the term for it, but when kids are left alone with software without human supervision, there can be like accidental mislearning, basically. Have you seen any traces of that in some of your observations?
I mean, I would say that, I don't know if it's accidental, but strategy development is, I think, the ultimate goal. For instance, when they get an even number denominator fraction, for them to discern that it's easier than looking at this giant bar and trying to figure out what 1/8 of it is, rather than splitting it in half first and then splitting those two halves in half. So, I mean, there have been explorations, and 2 of the interviews I was going to show y'all are just to show you that before we get the rest of our quantitative data, we did clinical interviews as exit interviews with the students, and we are finding that even the kids in certain conditions are explaining their conceptions of fractions by using the gestures that we gave them in the game. So in terms of that bleeding, I don't know how much of it is accidental, but I think that's a very good point and something for us to look at as we're prepping to do our next round of research this summer. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
I've got a comment followed by a question. I'm a researcher at the Games and Learning Society Center in Madison, so I work under Constance Steinkühler, herself a student at GMG and a big fan of Vygotsky. And the gesture stuff that you guys have articulated in Cyberchase is really, really sophisticated and just really well done in terms of getting students to think about what they're doing with their hands. And the question I have, kind of following along with that, is in terms of what Baker was talking about at his panel this afternoon, have you thought about having the game give intelligent feedback that's based on the kind of actions or the kind of missteps that students are making in-game? So, for example, if they organize fractions from smallest number in the denominator to largest number in the denominator, actually having the game tell them and kind of making an inference about the mistake that they're making and correcting it at a game feedback level rather than just showing them the solution.
Can I jump in for a second? As with the reality of a lot of projects, budget is a huge consideration. And this project specifically is a research project first. And the game has been very specifically designed around the research needs and the research questions and the data gathering. Other games that we've designed for Cyberchase, for instance, most recently Shape Quest, does have that kind of intelligent feedback. So we've built the scaffolding in such a way that the game understands what the child is doing and responds to that specific action. Like you might want to look at this piece over here, or have you tried rotating the game board? I'll take 2 pieces away for you, does this help? That sort of response. So it's definitely a consideration in everything we do in gaming. In this particular project, I think it is something that we can think about for future iterations, but the truth is the development budget impacts that in a large way.
Yeah, let me make a couple comments about that. One is that would be the next grant, right? First, we want to show that this approach works, right? And then they can justify getting a lot more money and more time the next time around. That's actually the way this is a cyber learning program, let's call it in itself. It's the way it works. You first have these exploratory grants to show that it's going to work, and then they give you more money and time. But also, we were trying to design the visual environment there and the gestural interaction so that it's also sort of self-explanatory, where just the display and stuff will help explain it to you. So some of it's built into that. But we would like to have more intelligent feedback in the future, I think.
Yeah,
do you want to say something, Michael?
Yeah, just from the design-based approach that we're using, because it's a 2x2 factorial and we have to compare one condition to another, there are accoutrements that we would like to add to the game that we can't because we have to keep control between the conditions. But absolutely, in the original outlay of the game, all that feedback was there, and then they go, "Oh, this is your budget? Oh, no." So.
Yeah, it's sort of along with his question, seeing the way teachers are trying to bring in gamification and games in their teaching and in learning. I'm wondering if you guys have built in or have plans to build in. I mean, I love the individualized feedback, but a teacher dashboard so the teacher can get that student feedback and then see it in a whole class layout where they can see how their teaching is is being perceived, and then how it's student to student. So IXL math, for instance, or some of these math programs, they're not necessarily games. A little bit of that, but that's incredibly valuable for teachers who look at all these apps and say, I'm not sure how I can build this in, and what will it give me back? How will I know it's working?
Yes, we definitely like to do that. In fact, this game is collecting everything the kid is doing. So there's an amazing amount of data there, and Michael mentioned data mining methods, or automatic methods that are looking at that. So there's a lot of information there over and above just what you see here that could be mined and give feedback to the teachers later. And we're going to work, there again, we hopefully that we'll have more phases to the project with the funding and the later ones, but then start to look more at the school context within which this would be integrated in. Teacher dashboard is a great idea. We definitely would need to have something like that to capture in a meaningful and simple way for people to look at, the complexity of what's going on here. And one of the great things about technology today can keep this kind of continuous record is we get away from just the one shot into the learning period test as the only way to measure it. Here we can keep a continuous record of what's going on. Yeah.
The previous question kind of sparked another one in my mind. As a teacher, we use Khan Academy a lot in my class, and it does have that functionality, and it's so comprehensive. And, kids can go year after year, and they're building their skill set, and it really, you get all kinds of visual information. I don't know if any of you have used that before, but I'm wondering how can programs like that be tied in? Like, is anybody working on something where the data that you might get from this type of program can be exported, or is where the programs are talking to each other? Because as a teacher, the idea of having all this information in one place is so useful, because I can see, this percent of my students can do this percent can't, this student can do these things, but there's a gap here, and that's preventing her from getting something else later on down the line. Let's go back and address that. And if there was a way that a fractions lesson that they're getting from an app that's, there's obviously a lot more fun than Khan Academy, but can they take the info from the fun thing and then tell another program, they know this already, so you can cross that one off the list?
I think you're highlighting a really important point, and that is currently in school, if a teacher wants to do an assessment, they give a paper and pencil test, which is not fun. The data from this type of a game is just as valuable, and it really gets at their understanding, but it needs to be digested for a teacher, whatever. So this iteration, as Dr. Black said, it's not geared towards that yet.
Right.
But hopefully in the future we would be able to add that sort of capability on. So that
I'm wondering, is anybody doing that?
Well,
actually, I've never heard of
as
anything.
it turns
like
out,
that.
some people from IBM Research came to see us the other day, and they developed a learning pathways program, which is basically a way of making recommendations amongst a whole set of learning materials about what's the appropriate one at a given time. Right. And this would be adaptive, where it would learn from experience too. Yeah. So they have these decision metrics and stuff put in there. And that would be the kind of integrated approach. So you sort of would play this, and based upon some problems you had with it, it might point to a Khan Academy video, you take a look at it as an explanation, and come back and do some work. So there does need to be that sort of integrative recommendation kind of system that coordinates all the different kinds of learning resources that are becoming available. And they're working, they want to collaborate with us on doing that. So we're looking forward to doing that. Yeah.
I have a question that's a bit different. It's not related to kids, it's related to adults. So is there any type of learning like this available for adults? My doctorate's in adult ed. And so I just think it's interesting in the world of...
the adults are like penguins and robots?
Well, benefit from something like this as well?
Well, actually, the fractioneer version they talk about is just purely abstract. It's like you're a fractioneer, your job is to divide these bars into fractional parts and so forth. So that, now actually, whether adding the story is even better, we're going to find out, for the kids. But certainly with the adults, they could, use that game. But also, that means there's a basic underlying game that could have various cover stories. So you could do a workplace cover story for adults or something to, build on top of the basic underlying game mechanics here. So this could be adapted for adults.
Yeah, I was just going to say the other angle, and we've done a little bit of experimentation, is a co-play angle where, children could play also with their parents and adults in their lives. This game has not been designed specifically with that in mind, but I think, with other PBS properties, that has been something, because we know that children and adults, whether parents, caretakers, watch together. I mean, and certainly we're looking at that then in the interactive space. So I think it's a very good point.
And this session went a little bit over, but I just want to thank the panel so much. This, I'm sure, very exciting.